Hey, what's going on, guys? We're talking about long-term athlete development today. This is something that we specialize in. We get a lot of athletes who are kind of like in that scaled RX intermediate level, kind of like a bubble athlete almost. And we are really good at taking them from where they are to where they want to be. And we're going to kind of talk about some systems or some ideas that we have in regards to that. So every time we get an athlete, there are certain numbers that they need to hit to, quote, play the game. The first thing we do is we want to look at the numbers that they have and where they want to go. So today we're going to walk you through what we would do with a 1 to 2 year athlete, a 3 to 5 year athlete, and a 5+ year athlete in the sport. And we're going to talk about this with the concept of what we call bucket. Concept was coined by a coach named Steve Magnus. He is a very prolific running coach. He coaches Olympic trials and Olympic athletes in the marathon, half marathon, 5K, 10K, and he is really good at taking athletes and developing them. And so when we look at this buckets concept, what it means for the running world is that you have a 5K bucket, you have a 3K bucket, you have a 10K bucket, a marathon bucket, a half marathon bucket, speed development bucket. Those are all kind of the buckets that comprise the running world. In CrossFit, we look at those buckets as strength development, aerobic development, movement development, sports developments, and skill development. And those are kind of all the buckets that we have inside of the CrossFit world. Now there's nuances to all of those, and that is kind of the fun of individualized programming. But when we're looking at an athlete, these are kind of the broad general schemes that we need to look at when going to develop that athlete. When starting up with an athlete, the first thing we do is always an assessment, and we'll look at their athletic background, what sports they played growing up, what their body type is, and what they're likely to be predispositioned to be good at in the sport. From there, we'll look at their training age. And this is where kind of that bucket concept really comes into play. So newer athletes, 1 to 2 years in the sport, we're trying to fill and get touches on as many proverbial buckets as we can. So their sports specific, their skill development with gymnastics, their strength development, their aerobic system development. We'll do this typically by starting classes. So we don't get a lot of athletes that come to us that are just out of like college or something like that, just wanting to get into CrossFit. For the most part, the class workouts take care of this, and you don't really necessarily need to be on a competitor's blog or an individual programming your first 1 to 2 years in the sport. Class workouts will take care of this and develop kind of like all those systems. The one thing that we do tend to find for outliers with this general rule of thumb is athletes who are more sprint-based in their sports, more endurance-based in their sports, or more biased towards some sort of Olympic weightlifting or powerlifting in their sport. Those athletes would do a little bit better with a more individualized program and shading them a little bit more in the direction that they need to go. So, for example, a sprint athlete needs to be shaded a little bit more inside of the aerobic system. So you might look at doing something like CrossFit work, but always having a cyclical machine involved in that. So 10 minutes at a easy echo bike into your CrossFit workout, or in their lifting, they might need to do slow, easy bikes in between their sets of strength development work. And this will help to develop that aerobic system and kind of shade it a little bit more. Vice versa, on the endurance side, we might just need to hammer on strength work all the time for those athletes. So that's kind of a newer athlete in the sport. Usually they should start with class workouts and then start to move into more competitive work programming after they kind of have had experience, learned the movements, and gotten a base level skill requisite. The next kind of tier that we have is a mid-level athlete, and this is, we'll find 2 to 5 years in the sport. At this point in time, the athlete has developed some biases in the programs that they're following, and some weaknesses in the sport have really started to show themselves with that athlete. And this is kind of where we come into play and individual coaching comes into play, is we can take that athlete, look at some of the biases that they've had in their programming in the past, look at some of the buckets that they need to fill now, and really start to focus on developing that athlete into what they need for the sport. So sometimes people come off of a competitor's program and they're really good at the sport, but they are missing something like their aerobic system. We see this a lot. The aerobic system tends to not get developed very well when people are coming off of competitors' programs. So we can take that athlete, work on developing their aerobic system, kind of shade the program a little bit more towards that, and then raise that level of proficiency in the sport because we got their aerobic system better. But the tricky part is making sure that we're touching on all the buckets because the sport is so chaotic. We need to make sure that we're touching on all the buckets throughout the course of the year and training cycles. But for the most part, we'll be able to look at what the athlete needs, and then their program will be very biased towards whatever it is that that athlete needs. The last athlete that we have is a 5+ year athlete in the sport. This athlete has probably followed several different training programs. They've had possibly several different coaches. They might be very well-rounded in the sport, where they aren't missing a ton of weaknesses in the sport. This doesn't mean that the athlete doesn't have things they need to work on in the sport, but it means that all their buckets are relatively the same height, and it's going to be a little bit more fine-tuning with their program and making sure that we keep all those buckets filled throughout the course of the year. It's also possible that this athlete has sought you out because of the biases in their programming, in your programming, and they're needing that specific bias to get them to the next level in the sport. So sometimes that just means you naturally writing what you're going to do as a coach, and that athlete will get better. Sometimes it means assessing the athletes, looking at the assessment in a little bit more detail and figuring out where that athlete needs to improve on, what progressions they may have or may not have done, and then giving that to the athlete. The last athlete that we have is a teen athlete, and this is kind of an interesting athlete that needs its own video in and of itself. But this athlete is kind of like a blank canvas. They don't have a lot of experience in anything, and you have several years, hopefully, to fill that canvas up. Ideally, what we're doing is we're putting them through very specific strength progressions, very specific aerobic progressions, and we're not getting very complex or creative with the design. Obviously, this is much easier said than done because there is a human element to coaching, but hopefully we can put them through very specific and straightforward progressions to get them better at the sport and progressing long term. The big thing in this is there's a study done in Sweden, and the study showed that athletes who specialized in a sport prior to the age of 15 peaked at the age of 18, while athletes that specialized in sport after the age of 15 went on and peaked later on throughout the course of their career. It's a little bit interesting to see in CrossFit right now as we're seeing some of the teen athletes graduating from the teen division into the individual division. There does, on the male side, appear to be some gap years there, but the female side, they're kind of getting right into it and rolling. We're just not sure how long their careers are going to last for. So we saw Haley Adams kind of stepped out of competition this last year. Mal O'Brien stepped out of competition this last year. Emma Carey's still going strong. So the book's kind of out on this still. Obviously, Dallin Pepper progressed in very easily. A couple of the guys did, but still some gap years there. So the book's still kind of out on this, and it does involve needing its own video. But ideally with them, we're again, still a newer athlete, so we're filling all the buckets, but we're getting very specific on each bucket with this athlete to build a really solid base. So hopefully this gives you guys some insight into how we develop athletes. When we get an athlete, we typically like to work with them for a minimum of 2 years. That's about how long it takes for the athlete to really develop the holes that they have in their game. Anything longer than 2 years is always awesome because you get to kind of see the long-term progress of an athlete. So yeah, hopefully this helps you guys out, and we'll catch you next time.